Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to have a truly international comparative testimonies about changes in higher education management across Europe. We'll have views from a number of countries, all somehow neighboring Poland, which is fantastic, because the model the countries are representing are still similar to our model, which is definitely post-communist, which is definitely Humboldtian, and there are a number of other features which link the countries represented here. How this panel is going to be structured? I believe I'll spend maybe 5 minutes saying a few words of interest to all of us, perhaps, and then I will ask each of the panel members about whom I'll say a few words in a second, for a 10-minute discussion how they view changes in management in their respective countries from their own experience as scholars, as practitioners, as administrators, and then, which will take about 50 minutes. After about 50 minutes, we'll pass on to a round of questions, maybe more individualized, maybe more based on individual experience. So there's a number of issues we want to discuss one by one. And finally, we'll have maybe a moment or longer moment for questions and answers. So who's going to panel members today? Professor Michael Dobbins, Professor of Education Policy of Goethe University of Frankfurt, Germany. Great pleasure. Professor Taras Finikov, President, International Fund for Education Policy Research from Ukraine. Great pleasure, Professor. Dr. Gergely Kováts, Director, Center for International Higher Education Studies of Corvinus University, Budapest, Hungary. Great pleasure. Professor Katrin Niglas, Vice-Rector for Research from Tallinn University, Estonia. And Mr. Juan Alegret, Director for Europe from the Blackboard company. A few words from me before we begin. Challenges of higher education management, international perspectives. Certainly there's a trio of issues: governance, management, and funding. And in this panel, we'll focus entirely on management, with some references to governance, which is relationships between universities and the state, universities and the buffer bodies, etc. And we will not focus on funding, because there will be a separate panel devoted specifically to funding. I would say that all three elements are present in the current Polish reforms, and it will be somehow a point of reference to some of us, perhaps to me as a moderator, but not too much. We need international perspectives. But certainly I need to say that this management and the changes in the management at the lowest institutional level are those changes which touch us sometimes almost personally. We see the differences in management, we see some difference in governance, and we see some difference in funding. But management of higher education institutions is what us, scholars, practitioners, administrators, touches almost personally. What is important in this context, just a few maybe snapshots. Boards of trustees, enormously important. The boards are, as you know, somehow powerless and somehow underfunded, but they are there. Our universities definitely need some overseeing bodies, some boards of trustees, taken as a word is taken from corporate sector, to see what's going on from the outside. We needed it, we fought for it, it's there. It's powerless, but it's already there. So board of trustees is important at the management level. Nominated deans. This is a revolution, I would say, at the management level in Poland. We still can't believe that deans will be nominated rather than elected by our councils. But that's what's going to happen. Also vice-rectors who are somehow elected and nominated and gotten rid of by rectors. So in a word, centralized powers in our universities. The leadership finally is enormously strong. I don't know to what extent we see the power of our rectors. We have seen it in selected universities already, but what we will see in the next term of rectorship is beyond recognition compared to today. So centralization of power, which also means strong leadership. Finally, this fragmentation of power at the level of institutions is going to disappear. Because of evaluation, research evaluation and assessment exercises, our universities are changing the structures, and this fragmentation is disappearing because leadership is becoming real leadership with possible positive, but also with possible negative consequences. Just imagine what happens if rectors are not those who we, all of us, imagined preparing Law 2 Ustawa 2.0 changes. If it's not exactly the rector we thought, like reform-minded rector, but it's totally anti-reform-minded rector. Can you imagine the power of those rectors? I can. So it's a big challenge to the Polish system. Listening to our honorable panel members, let's keep in mind our Polish issues, our changes at the level of governance a bit, but especially at the level of institutional higher education management. So let's listen to stories, sometimes personal, from those countries represented here, and compare those changes to our changes in Poland. This was my introduction, and now let's move on to stories in the sequence which is in the program. So the first, let me have a look who is the first, please. Professor Michael Dobbins is the first, yes? Yes. You can use this mic or whichever is
sitting would be nice, actually,
okay.
For a change. Yes, it's thank you so much, Marek, and thank you very much to all of you for the invitation to Warsaw. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here and see some old and new colleagues. Yes, the situation in Germany. Essentially, there is no German higher education system because higher education is a domain of the Länder, the German federal state. So effectively, you could say there are 16 different higher education systems, and every university is essentially a microcosm. So it's very, very difficult to generalize, make generalizations about the entire system. The historical starting point, like in Poland, a very Humboldtian-oriented system, very bottom-heavy, strong professors, whereas historically there has been no tradition of leadership, central leadership, strong university management. That's a new phenomenon in all of Germany, so essentially a very fragmented, bottom-heavy system. I heard the word before also during one of the speeches, primus inter pares, so say like first among equals. That's a tradition with the German rectors. You also have to distinguish between rectors and university presidents. Some Länder, some German states have a president who has a little bit more authority, more competences, whereas others have a more traditional rector system. The system itself in Germany, I would say it's very, very underfunded, so that is a major problem for university management, and a major issue. We're going to talk a little bit about personal experiences. I think that's important. Career pathways are very, very, very uncertain in the German context. Nevertheless, the output of the German higher education system is relatively good in international comparison, despite the underfunding. The problem with the funding is that only the Länder, only the states fund the university system. There's very little federal money, no tuition fees, a relatively low level of contract-based research, and so forth. 2006, the so-called Kooperationsverbot, ban on cooperation, which basically said higher education is exclusively the domain of the German Länder. We also have in German, because of the Maastricht criteria, a so-called debt break. So that means that the Länder cannot accumulate debt, even if it is based, with the aim of investing more in education and human capital and so forth. And at the same time, the situation is expanding. The student numbers are rising, but the funding remains constant, relatively steady. As for the reforms, Bologna was very consequential in the German context, new study structures. There have been efforts to strengthen university management. There's been new mechanisms of quality assurance at the faculty level, at the management level, new processes of accreditation, re-accreditation, and so forth. What we also have is the so-called Zielvereinbarung, the target agreements between the individual universities and the government, which specifies certain objectives and goals for the individual universities. So this has indeed strengthened the university management because they must coordinate these agreements with the Länder. There's also more competition nowadays between universities and the so-called Fachhochschulen, which are polytechnics or universities of applied sciences. At the same time, Germany has increased spending on pre-primary education, like kindergarten and so forth, also the integration of refugees and so forth. It's been very cost-intensive for the government, so we're in this position of chronic underfunding, and this places a major burden on university management in Germany. Nevertheless, some new mechanisms, for example, more output-based funding, both from the government as part of these target agreements, as well as within universities. So universities are rewarded, for example, if they have many PhD graduates, many women professors, let's say good integration of refugees, immigrants, and so forth. However, the personnel policies, the human resource policies of German universities have remained very, very conservative. There's been very little movement, very, very little progress. Basically, the state still regulates the pay scale. So everyone, if I publish, let's say, 100 articles in 1 year, and there's someone who publishes 2 articles, the payment, the salaries are exactly the same. So this places a major restriction on university management. All the employees are employees of the Länder, the German federal states, and there's basically very few output-based funding mechanisms. The contracts are relatively rigid, the contractual conditions and so forth, so there's little flexibility. So I would say that the system in Germany is still embedded in the historical context with some smaller reforms aimed at more market orientation and so forth. However, we still have this very, very, very heavy involvement of the government in the university system, and this places, of course, massive challenges, or creates massive challenges for university management. How do you manage strategically, entrepreneurially steer a university when you're so constrained by governmental restrictions with regard to salaries and so forth? So what the managers essentially do is a lot of public relations work, a lot of negotiations within university, but it's very, very difficult because of the funding constraints and constraints with regard to personnel policy that are imposed on them. As for university management, my experiences at 2 universities, I must also say I'm no longer at the University of Frankfurt officially, I'm now at Konstanz, and this also has this sort of an issue with university management, which I'd like to talk about actually today, my own experience, but generally the level of interaction between faculty and management is relatively low. If I think, for example, about the University of Frankfurt, the management building, it has police, it has security, it's almost like soldiers standing there, so it's very inaccessible, I would say. So there's not much positive interaction going on between university management and the individual faculties and researchers. I would say my university, it's a little bit more informal, more interactive, and so forth. But I think at many universities, management is essentially a bureaucratic monstrosum, sort of like a state bureaucracy to some extent. And there's a lot of tension. You hear a lot of things within the faculty, a lot of critique of university management, and so forth. Very slow decision-making, because decision-making in German higher education has become much, much more multilateral. We used to have just the senates, faculties, and rector. Now we have what's called Hochschulrat, which is the university council, governing council, which includes external stakeholders, and so forth. We have more committees at the university level. We have the Länder, we have the federal government, which is also involved in funding. So it's very, very complicated nowadays. My problem with university management is essentially, my one experience was, I was at one university, had a very, very large research grant from German DFG, that's a German Research Foundation, Polish, and the Polish NCN. It was the largest grant at the institute, at the faculty. I don't like to be, let's say, arrogant, but my publications were very, publication output was very, very good, and played a critical role in the university life and teaching and research and so forth. And at the very largest project at the entire institute, what happened? Couldn't stay at the university because of some legal restrictions. The contract went for 6 years. It's regulated by the government. So what I have to do, pack my bags, clean my office, take the project to another university, which is great. It's great being somewhere else. But there's this big transition for everyone, and I'm just wondering, what is the logic, Shouldn't management have an incentive to keep people that are productive, that are bringing in money? And this happened to many, many, many of my colleagues. In fact, the assistant professors, the so-called junior Professoren in Germany, they had large research funding, they had projects, they attracted employees and talent and human capital to their universities. And when their contract ended after 6 years, they had to leave and go somewhere else. And most of them, I'm actually the exception, most of them went abroad to other countries, whether to Austria, Denmark, Sweden, France, and so forth. So personally, I think it's very, very hard to manage or administer an institution where, let's say, 80% of the people are on not permanent contracts, limited contracts. So, how can you, I think in general, management in Germany should do more to keep the people there that are productive. I mean, it's great to attract international talent and so forth from abroad, but I think there could be much, much more done to keep the people that are already there. I mean, how can you create a sense of identity, solidarity? How can you motivate people when 70, 80, 90% of them have short-term contracts? And as I said, because of these legal regulations, there's really no possibility to keep the productive people. So that is basically my experience with German higher education management. I can't say I'm involved in all these processes internally and so forth. I'm just an academic. But I just find it very, very difficult to manage or regulate or govern an institution when you're so constrained by governmental bureaucracy and these short-term contracts and so forth. So that's a major, major obstacle to German university management and further development of human resources, I think. Yeah?
That's enormously heterogeneous picture from lender to lender, but overall, to all of us, it's a pessimistic story. So we need to be afraid and listen carefully to those stories, because Germany is #1 partner for international collaboration for Poland in terms of funding, in terms of publications, and the closest model for Poland traditionally is Germany, the Humboldtian model. So we need to be very careful, listen to you, listen to others, read a lot, and know what to avoid in the future, because the story you're telling, 80% of people without tenure working on contracts, short-term contracts, 5 to 7 years, I would say it's hardly acceptable in Poland. So we need to be very careful and see what's the impact of those transformations in the largest European knowledge producer on the continent. So thank you so much. We'll come back to the details in the round of questions. And now let's move on to Professor Taras Finikov from here or wherever you prefer.
From this place.
Okay, fantastic.
First of all, I want to say that for me it's great pleasure to participate in this panel. And it's especially interesting because I follow this LUMEN project during last 4 years, and I have such feeling that this is very important as a place for our trying to exchange mutual opinions. Because in many cases, our situation, Ukrainian situation, and developments of our national system of higher education is the influential factor for the Poland too, because half of foreign students in Polish universities, this is Ukrainian students. And many other factors influence for our own national system. And I want to start with some maybe key figures that characterized the Ukrainian national higher education system. We have in this moment 290 universities, academies, and institutes, which consist our system of higher education, and we have 1,200,000 students. I want to say that 10, 12 years ago, we have 350 universities, academies, and institutes, and we have 2,400,000 thousand students. You can imagine how is great this decline. We have near 100,000 scientific and pedagogical employees in our universities. And maybe a very important figure is that 10 years ago we have 800,000 graduates from secondary schools every year. And now we have less than 400,000 graduates which finish our secondary schools. And maybe last figure I want to share with you, this is the figure that near 80% of the secondary school graduates enroll to the higher education. I want to say 80. And if we taking into account the people who go abroad, we have now situation with 85% who are enrolled in higher education inside and outside of the country. Since 2014, our educational system have been undergoing a rapid process of changes. It's connected with the general situation in the country, with all transformation which we have. Sometimes this process is rather chaotic and lacking the necessary resources. Our goals sometimes is more such great than our possibilities to achieve these goals. This year, current year, 2019, was a year of great political transformation in our country. Maybe firstly, in the history of Ukrainian independent state, we are the situation when all power in the country concentrated in the hands of one political force. The president position, the government, and the majority in our parliament. We never had such situation, and it's from one side, this is the great possibility, from other side, this is something maybe even dangerous. Today, we have such curious thing that maybe we have the most youngest Minister of Education and Science in the world. This lady has 29 years old. If we speak in general, the main topic, the main problem is the transformation of the secondary school, the really secondary education reforms. It started 2.5 years ago, will be continued next 10, 12 years, and this is, we see in Ukrainian, this is the new Ukrainian school program, mobilize the major share of the resources. And it means that we have not the possibility to add the great resources for the higher education. In the field of the higher education reform, we have the domination of such as possible to say pragmatism and focused on some key aspects. If we speak about managerial issues, the movement is from the collegiality to managerialism. We are in the same way as your system, maybe in other tempo and with some specific details. If we speak about financial issues, we have in the situation of the replacement of the traditional principles of budget financing from achieved, which is such as an element from the old socialist system, to the formulaic approach, where the scale of institution, its indicators in international rankings, the scientific and economical activity will be evaluated. This is if this system will in reality start to work, will be such as the iceberg for our educational system. In the development of our autonomy issues, we have the transfer in the state university to the rights to determine the number and structure of the position of the employees and the amount of remuneration for them. Before this moment, it's regulated by state, by ministry, and now we are in the beginning of this very, very influential process in our university transformation. And the important maybe thing for our internal situation, this is the policy of contracts and prices. We try to introduce such anti-dumping regulation in this story because the contract is very important for the financing of our systems, and we have many dumping situations, and ministry tries to implement the strict anti-dumping regulation. If we speak about the field of quality assurance, we launched in the beginning of this year the National Agency for Higher Education Quality Assurance. This is not the first attempt, it may be even third attempt of implementing such structure. And this new structure faced three difficulties tasks. First of all, to introduce new accreditation procedure in accordance with the ASG, streamline the process of dissertation defense. We try to change old system of permanent scientific councils to the scientific councils for each current situation ad hoc, and to develop the components of the quality assurance system as internal, external, and to create the independent quality agencies, which don't exist in our Ukrainian practice. And maybe important decision which is really influenced for the whole system is to withdraw colleges, different kind of technical schools, technicums, from the higher education system. They involved in this system 20 years ago, and return them to the separate area of vocational training. In our maybe specific language, we say pre-higher professional education. This is not the easy process, and we must prepare and adapt it the special law, which is adopted by our parliament in the mid of this year in summer. And maybe as the final, I want to say that during many years we have such elements of our educational system as state diploma on higher education. And now, maybe 7-8 days ago, was adopted some new portions of amendments to the law of higher education, and we practically cancelled this element, and each university have the rights to issue their own diploma in own form with some formal registration, but practically this is the next new element. In general, I want to say the system is in such process of higher dynamics. We have some leaders, we have many universities which is not ready for all this transformation, and we have the situation when we need to maybe produce such policy which is from up to down. But our hope is that this policy can revitalize our university communities, and they can be able start with bottom to up.
Thank you so much. What is really important, I believe, is that in Ukraine, all those reforms which we are talking about in the context of other European countries, these reforms are somehow delayed. There are elements, there are periods of stops and goes in Ukraine. I've been following Ukrainian reforms for almost 2 decades now. We published a book with Taras almost 20 years ago about Polish law and higher education and the changes which might be introduced in Ukraine. And we did many more things together and published a lot. I'm not saying what we are doing, but we did a lot. And anyway, the changes are slow and the reforms are enormously so. So the context different, which makes a difference between Poland and Ukraine is probably demographics. While in Poland, the impact of demographics is already consumed. We don't expect ever huge decreases in student numbers. For Ukraine, I believe it's only the beginning. So it's, demographics is enormously important. Yes, thank you so much. And now the Hungarian context, please. Gergely, if you tell us more about the challenges from your perspective, please.
Thank you very much. Last year there was a conference in Budapest where Professor Woznicki and his colleague talked about this LUMEN conference, this event. And I found this discussion very fascinating because it tells a story about how higher education management professionalized here or started to professionalize here in Poland. And we don't have that kind of event in Hungary, and that is because higher education management evolved in a bit different way, I think, and that's what I talk about. I work in a university with a social science discipline that is very strong in social science and business, and I work in the research, I teach, and I work in the administration as well, so I have quite a lot impression about what happens in higher education management in Hungary. And in 2008, there was a report ordered by the European Commission about funding and governance reforms in European countries between the last 2 decades. And the main message of the conference, of that report, was there is a general trend from government to governance, which by that they mean that there is a trend from direct supervision of institutions to a steering from a distance, as it is said. And I think that was the case in Hungary since the change of the regime, and perhaps in most Central European countries. But in the last decade, I think in Hungary it seems that this trend turned, and if I may say, the pendulum struck back. And how did it happen? Well, first of all, there was a change of government in 2010, and it has a quite different way of understanding higher education. They wanted more role of the state, and they wanted more influence of the state, how higher education develops. They increased their role. How that happened? For example, they changed the constitution and said that the funding and governance of institutions are regulated by the state itself. It is not a matter of institutional autonomy. They started directly appointed financial directors, internal controllers, and other supervisory board members and other important officers of the university. Later, they introduced the so-called chancellor system. I'm going to talk about because that's very important in higher education management. Between 2004 and 2014, the public funding of institutions decreased by almost 50%, which is a huge decrease, while the number of students decreased in the same period by only 20%. So it was way much better decrease of public funding, and at the same time, the rate or the percentage of targeted funds and earmarked funds also increased, which means the dependency of institutions from the government heavily increased during this period. If you take a look at the institutional autonomy report of the EUA, you will see that the institutional autonomy of Hungarian institutions decreased considerably in funding, in organization, more or less in HR. That is how the general context of Hungarian higher education changed. Now let me talk about this chancellor system, because I think that is a very good example how the management changed. There is a new position called chancellor. The chancellor is responsible for the administration and the budget. It has or he or she has a veto power in budgetary questions. And the chancellor is selected by the ministry and appointed by the prime minister. There is no formal involvement of the institution how the chancellor is selected. The chancellor has a very strong position within the university. Basically, it's a dual executive structure, because the law says that the leader of the university is the rector, but in the matter of budgetary questions, the chancellor is the leader, or the chancellor can be considered as the leader of the institution. And I don't say that this dual leadership structure is something illegitimate. It's completely legitimate. There are many examples in public organizations, in hospitals, in theaters, in other university organizations, in Germany, for example, where that kind of structure exists. But I think the cultural context is a little bit different, and that makes a difference. The introduction of the chancellor system changed the higher level of management completely. The rector is no longer a full-fledged manager of the institution who is responsible for everything. He is responsible only for academic matters, while the chancellor responsible for administration and budgetary issues. But there is an important question here, where is the loyalty of the chancellor is? So where the state ends and where this institution begins, where is the border of the organization that is completely blurred in this structure, because it is difficult to say whether the chancellor is the agent of the government in the institution, or reverse, it is the agent of the institution in the government. And it is very difficult to tell, and people confuse an institution and treat chancellors quite differently, depending how they understand that kind of loyalty problem. Of course, there are a lot of questions about who are the chancellors. Many of them became chancellor without prior experience with higher education, with the institution itself. So these are questions. And I can say that chancellors who come from inside the institution are generally more successful in many, many terms. We did a lot of survey among academic people and among chancellors about the benefits and disadvantages of the chancellor system. And, well, the general benefits are usually told as the administration is more professionalized, running administration more disciplined and more careful, better and stronger relationship with the ministry. The arrival of a chancellor disrupted the status quo of the institution, which was the obstacle of progress. We always know the situation when the rector is selected, he appoints his member or his man in different positions, and it's very difficult to change that situation. And the arrival of the chancellor, this situation is completely changed. On the other hand, there are a lot of problems, which are also mentioned in these interviews. Many people talk about increased inflexibility and bureaucratization. There is an interesting conflict within institutions because the administration under the supervision and guidance of the chancellor is very hierarchical, very strong, while the academic side is very fragmented, and there are fights between the two sides, and the coming of the chancellor makes divided the organization much more in several higher education institutions. There are reports about how the chancellor abused his position. The main problem with this chancellor system is that there is no real institutional control over the chancellor, because the chancellor is appointed and supervised by the minister. So if there is some conflict between the rector and the chancellor, the institution is very difficult position to enforce its interest. And of course, there is a question of accountability. This new public management movement is about make one person accountable for the institution and empower him or her so the management can do all the things. And if you have two leaders who are interconnected with each other, interdependent with each other, it's very difficult to tell who is responsible if things go wrong. Is it the chancellor? Is it the rector? There is also an interesting field. It seems obvious to divide the organization as the academic side and the administration side, but there are a lot of units which are in between. So, for example, quality assurance. The quality assurance of academic program, should it belong to the chancellor? Should it belong to the rector? The management of developmental EU projects, developmental projects, should it be an academic thing or should it be a chancellor administrative thing? And there are a lot of such questions which makes confusion in some organization and good results in other one. And so this is how management evolved, and from this perspective, it is interesting to see that there are rectors who are very content with this kind of development because they say, we don't care about administration, we don't care about funding, we don't know much about legal regulations, we want to deal with research and education and other things, and that's completely fine. And they find the relationship with their chancellor is good. While others, there is constant fight and paralysis of the organization, which the organization cannot manage. So what is important to say here is that the success of such a system depends mainly on whether we have a culture of cooperation or whether we have a culture of domination. And I'm not very optimistic about that because as far as I see, Hungary and Central and Eastern European countries are usually a country where the generalized trust is low, while the specific trust, I mean trust in people with my close neighborhood who are in my network, is quite high. And if this general trust is low, that means coming from outside means a very difficult situation for a manager to manage, and that makes this dominance kind of fighting very probable, if I may say that. Just let me finish with one more example which tells you the story how the system evolved further in Hungary. That is a very new phenomenon. Currently it happened with the Corvinus University, where I came from. This university was changed from a public institution into a private one maintained by a foundation created by the government. And that foundation was donated €1 billion of stocks, more than €1 billion, mainly of the stocks of an oil company and a pharmaceutical company. And this foundation is managed by external stakeholders, the CEO of the national oil company, the CEO of the National Bank, Central National Bank, the former foreign minister, and other kind of people. And that board attracts all the major decision-making power to itself, which means the decision-making power of the Senate and internal members of the institution in many questions just simply left out. So deciding the budget, deciding the strategy, deciding the program structure, deciding the bylaw of the institution belong now to this trust or belong to this board, which is a very good example, the managerial way of institutional management, because they now force the institution a very strong managerial perspective, which is, on one hand, this is desirable, this is necessary, this is good. On the other hand, I don't feel it something which I can attach myself to because I'm left out of decisions. The decision making is not transparent, people are not involved in these decisions. So it is very difficult to say whether this is the good way of management. Perhaps it is because I'm more attached to the collegial way of decision making, I don't know. Perhaps I think an expert organization like the university shouldn't be managed without the involvement of the colleagues. So this is happening right now. This is happening at my institution right now, and this is a very fresh one. And in Hungary, there is a intention to create that kind of institution, to transform higher education institutions from public into private ones, not with that kind of donation, perhaps with some other framework they will use, because they cannot afford to give 1 billion euro for each institution. But there is a clear intention to move in that way. And I think that makes a huge challenge for institutional management in Hungarian institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this powerful picture. Indeed, we need to be careful to remember how somehow lucky we were when we were defended on the one hand by Rectors' Conference and on the other hand by some politicians, and in creating Ustawa 2.0, Law 2.0, procedures, bylaws, and the law itself, we avoided this possible danger of having the state exactly in the very center of our institutions. This chancellor system, we knew about it. And I even told my younger colleagues, let's not discuss it more publicly, and let's not write about it, because it's a perfect example, and it can be perfectly abused in the Polish case. So we knew about the system. We knew the dangers. We discussed it with Gergely also a couple of years ago. And fortunately, it's a very tempting model to have highly managerial approach combined with the state present through its direct representative in the very center of the organization. So, so far, I would say we were able to avoid this model, but still it's very tempting in a number of countries, because it's appealing to those focused on managerialism, and it's also appealing to those who want more state, and particularly political state, in our institutions. It was really an enlightening story. Thank you so much. And now let's move on to Professor Katrin Niglas, and let's hear the, I would say, huge success story of Estonia. When I look at bibliomatics and the knowledge production and field-weighted citation impacts, etc., Estonia is just unbeatable. So it's a huge success story, but still, how it looks at the level of management, we'll hear the story from you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I won't hesitate. It is a success story. Estonia in general as a country, small and fast, in contrary to many, maybe it's some can say that lack of traditions, but we don't believe it's true. But the desire to change after post-Soviet or in the post-Soviet, and yes, just by OECD, more than 40% of the population, grown-up population, is having higher education. So it's not only the country, but also the educational system. PISA results quite high, and now very recently from my university, the Young and Eager University, we are very proud that 3 of our universities in a small country are in QS and Times higher education rankings now quite seriously in. I have to say, in our university, 9 years ago when we started with the current rector who has been re-elected in the meanwhile and then to hold the position, we decided purposefully not to do anything for getting into rankings, but to do everything we can to advance the university. But as time is limited, let me just structure a bit my story, and it's my story, biased, you can be sure, but just 4 lines of thought that first of all, on the behind of that success, the kind of intrinsic belief in education from 150 years ago, maybe even 200 years ago. And so we Estonians believe that Estonia as an independent country only exists because of this, our grandfathers and mothers were taking up the education. So, but on the other hand, now, as it was mentioned, the funding issues, enormous autonomy of the universities, but on the other hand, an external evaluation system, very strong and strict and rigid. Good neighbors and European possibilities of European funding, plus extremely, again, top in the world, extremely competition-based research funding. More than 80% recently is competition-based. And then finally the constant reform, which we suffer all, but we are happy at the same time. So that let me come to open up a bit these four lines. The high value for education. After the second independence, now what suddenly happened during 20 years, from 95 to 2005, the number of higher education students increased, tripled, and it was up to 5% of the population, 5% of the population being students in the higher education. And it was possible because private money was allowed to be in our university. It was 50% of students paying themselves, or their parents paid, the families paid, and the state paying quite generously also for the education in these early years. And then indeed the financial crisis came. Our universities didn't suffer too much the early years of crisis because they had managed to save something of that from that generous. But then by 2012, the crisis was there. So that ever since 2012, the reform in higher education was done, so that it was forbidden to take for Estonian taught courses the fees. So that the state declared it as allowing greater access to the higher education. In today's realities, it's definitely the opposite, because young people have to go away, as universities by the state budget cannot offer as many places. So now we have dropped 30% of the study places in Estonia, in universities, so that yes, so, and for the management or the leaders of the universities, this past years have meant that this thing the people in the universities had developed, that we need to do better, we need to do more, and we will get more funds if we do it well. So now it has been to turn down, so that everything is about focusing, doing less, having less programs, so that saying no to people, so that it has been a lot of negotiations, a lot of kind of turning negative feelings into some progressive, because in the beginning, indeed, this focusing was a healthy thing. Now we have reached the critical point, as I feel, so if we have to do it for some other years, our critical mass is becoming too small to be successful in the future, as we have been so far. So that it's pretty much the great autonomy. Yes, it's feeling of ownership, responsibility. We do own our buildings. We are responsible for finances. We don't have the chancellors, thank God. But now we are going to have more involvement from outside with another reform, so that we will have three level management: the rector, the university board, which is small board but majority outside of the university, and then the senate, and you can imagine the funds are mostly to the university board to decide, but rector brings the topics to the board anyway, so that yes, and with the the boom in the early years was handled by the very strict, already in 1997, the very strict evaluation, external evaluation system was, and we have on the one hand benefited a lot, but suffered a lot as well, and this has been a challenge. Sometimes we feel that more time of all our academics goes for preparing the evaluation reports, the self-evaluation reports, than actually doing academic things. And then if you get these suggestions, which are basically usually the ones you have noted yourself, you don't have time to implement those, even though you believe into them, but you have to start to prepare the next report for the next curriculum. But there has been good movements to lessen this burden as well. So that good neighbors, not too much to say, but with the new political affairs, actually the internationalization, which we believe in, and believe that it's the only way the Estonia can be great if we cooperate, and so is put under the question. Sometimes universities are blamed of bringing in unwelcome people, meaning international students, and so on, so that this kind of challenge and struggle to actually maintain the liberal, open-minded values, which are not supported by all the new government parties, as you may have heard. So there's a lot of struggle here to calm down our staff, that yes, the university managers are standing out for the universities and not just letting them beat us, the universities. And just a very last comment, so that the success has its price, and now I'm coming to that constant reform thing, and that's a big managerial issue. People are tired of it. They say, let us do our work. No, don't start another reform. But there are 3 coming anyway, every kind of point of time. So you have to convince people, motivate people that it's we can do it for good of ourselves, and we can somehow. But also I feel that there is at this critical point coming that yes, for 20 years we have, because people are ambitious and want to grow and be, but now there seems to be a drop that's very difficult to motivate to people to go for another new reform, so that we are talking more about inclusive leadership than managerialism, as we are sometimes blamed of neoliberalism and going with this all customer mentality as the university leaders, so that but yes, daily business, balancing academic values and freedom with practical considerations to actually do good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the story. As we can summarize those stories so far, except for one, we realize that reforms are an ongoing story. Reforms are permanent state, and it's enormously important for us academics to live in this state of permanent uncertainty and permanent changes. While it's perhaps livable for administrators, for scholars, it's just enormously difficult. What we avoided in Poland certainly was this massive competition and this massive changes which we saw in Estonia. I've read a lot of papers about project-based funding and consequences of strictly project-based, enormously competitive and almost only competitive research funding. So success was painful and it hurt, well, academics, all of us, I would say. So this is another lesson from Estonia. Enormous success in terms of publications, impact, global impact, etc. But there are costs, and again, reforms are ongoing in all these countries we discussed so far. And finally, Juan, from a somehow outsider's perspective, please, can you?
Yes, thank you. So really, that is my role. I believe I'm the outsider here. I'm not representing any university. I'm not representing any country. I am not an academic, and I am from Spain, okay, and working for a leading company offering platforms and solutions for teaching and learning. I've been working, and that's maybe why I'm here in this panel, more than 20 years throughout Europe and with the higher education system, institutions, with helping them to transform. Transform maybe the core business of the university, or one of the core businesses of university, which is the teaching and learning. Okay, so all the universities are based on the research and innovation, but as well on teaching. Even if sometimes, 2 weeks ago, someone in La Sorbonne, the president of La Sorbonne, was proposing that universities also have to have not just this triangle, but moving to a square, adding the social and the social part as well into the role of a university. So, after hearing the other panelists, maybe with the 3 first, I was a little bit, I would say, demotivated, okay, because I'm perceiving what is the old Europe, okay? It's still looking to ourselves, still with old-fashioned, I will say, management and governance in the higher education system, which doesn't allow the institutions to really compete, be more agile, be more flexible, be faster into a world that we live today, and it's not myself who say that it's really changing very, very rapidly. And the perception, not from the academic, but from the outside, and I'm representing maybe the outside, is that universities are not moving fast enough and are not adaptable enough, and that when we compare to other parts of the world, mainly with the US, but as well with many of the Asian universities or from China, we are getting a little bit behind, okay? So I don't know if we share this feeling, but that's a kind of feeling. At least with the Estonia view, we had a little bit of more fresh, okay, perspective from a fast-changing university system, okay, that has led Estonia to, I believe, a position that just it was unbelievable a few years ago. I wanted to spend a few minutes, okay, talking from the perspective of a new European Union initiative or European Commission initiative, despite I am not working for the European Commission, despite I'm not working for any university. But there's a new initiative called European Universities under the umbrella of the Erasmus Plus program, okay, that has been launched, and looking it from the outside, I believe it's the first time I see the European Commission to go fast, okay? So the idea to launch these European universities and was just launched really in the fall of 2017, okay? And one of the, I would say, fathers was Emmanuel Macron in one of the speeches he did in La Sorbonne. But then very quickly, the European Commission took the lead, launched a program, and in June this year, this idea of having transnational universities in Europe is still is a reality, or at least a pilot, okay? So in June this year, 17 cross-European alliances were announced out of 54 that were applying to it. And there are 114 universities part of these European Universities Alliances. Amongst them, 5 from Poland, okay, so which I believe it's very important. And that's the new, I would say, game changer for our, for the higher education, I would say, industry, okay? The idea is that universities shouldn't just be looking at themselves. their management, which there is a lot of improvement, the governments, which there is also a lot of room for improvement and being more agile. But we need to start looking that we are in a global world and we need to compete in this global world. And maybe the strength from Europe is to cooperate and collaborate. Okay, so we've had many programs pushing the collaboration and the exchange of students, of professors, of researchers all across Europe. And this program, European Universities Initiative, is really looking for that. It's building cross-national universities, focusing in different topics, and putting in the hands of the professors, the researchers, and something that just no one mentioned here, the students, the future of the university. The idea behind is that students, as well as professors, but mainly from the student point of view, have to be able to choose their career. So how I'm going to study, taking the best from each of the universities that are part of an alliance. To be able to achieve this kind of mobility or extreme mobility is not just like the Erasmus program that I sent for a semester a student to another country. Here really it's that designing the path, the learning path from a student that maybe he's going to do, okay, so one topic in the University of Frankfurt, another topic in the university in Tallinn, another topic in, so having this mobility, physical, but as well virtual mobility. That needs to transform the core of the universities as well. Our teaching models sometimes have not benefited from this digital transformation that we have it all over the industries. In many of our universities, we keep teaching the same way we were teaching 100 years ago, okay? But to achieve this mobility or this transformation, we need to change as well the way we teach and putting digital systems there that are going to help us to retrieve data and take decisions based on data and proven information and not just perceptions. So that's a huge challenge. The new call has been launched 2 weeks ago in a conference that was held in Brussels. It was leading the universities of the future. I was in this conference. I must say that it was very powerful. There was a lot of excitement. More than 800 people was there. And I believe that's the spark or the catalyst from what I will say, dormant university system all across Europe that needs to wake up, react, move fast in order to bring to our students, but to our societies as well, the needed change of today. So what is my role, okay, being from a leading company offering platforms and solutions? The challenge is that these European universities have these 17 alliances and the 24 that will be selected by mid-2020, they have many, many challenges. Many challenges in areas like management, in the governance, in quality assurance. So how I'm going to be able to frame that a student is going to be able to go from university to university to get his degree. How I'm going to be able to have professors moving as well from different places or from home, but on a digital environment. It's already a very complex environment, and this program, it's only for, right now, it's a pilot for 3 years, and they need to bring some results, okay? So from our side, being an education and technology company, what we are proposing and offering is the type of solutions that at least from the technical point of view, this mobility, this collaboration is going to be able to be done easily and integrated with the different systems. We need to then look on a higher level. I believe this path that still many universities don't take attention to the teaching and learning. They just have local solutions. It's just something to have, but not really something that is transformative. That needs to change, okay? And with that, I believe that we have this positive, and I want to be very positive, seems to be that the European Commission, and I believe that many universities as well, are awakening, okay? So they are not dormant anymore. We need to move forward. We need to compete. We need to be able to stop this brain drain that we have towards the US or towards many Asian universities. And I believe this initiative, and I'm not representing it, but I'm at least talking, the European Universities Initiative, it's a key instrument that can help us to modernize our old-fashioned university systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I need to say a word. It's always fantastic to hear views from the EC or from the business sector. I spent years on academic entrepreneurialism, and I spent years in university business forums, and I've heard over the last decade so many calls for change, for awake, for game-changing funding, that I got used to it. So I would say, let's stay calm. We have 20 million students in Europe, and we have about 1 million researchers across Europe. And it's not so easy to change that. It's fantastic to hear inspiring stories and calls for action. But we have actions and reforms ongoing all the time. And certainly the EC and this European universities idea would promote 3 times as many reforms as what you are having right now. So I would say, let's stay calm. It's always good to have outsiders' views, but still it's outsiders. I participated in those programs on entrepreneurialism and university business links for a decade and a half right now. And I would say, stay calm. We have 6 minutes, which leaves each of you maybe 1 minute for some final comment, please. Starting from Michael, going in this direction to Juan, yes?
Specifically on what topic, what issue? Do you have a question, or should I just...
We have just final word right now, so we didn't have this round of questions, we didn't manage. So whatever we find useful or interesting, we just say it.
Yeah, I just think it's crucial for universities to have the mechanisms to keep let's say, the talent that they have. And there are many also positive examples from Germany. We do have this initiative of excellence and so forth. And there are some universities that have really turned out to be like elite universities. And I think their strategy has been a combination of doing what they can in terms of relatively flexible contracts, contractual arrangements, and trying at the same time to attract international talent. But as I said, the bureaucracy from the government is just a major obstacle and burden. So I think yeah, that would be the strategy, more entrepreneurialism, more flexibility, more real, actual, factual autonomy for universities, a diversification of funding. I think universities are over-reliant on state funding. I think tuition fees at a very moderate, sustainable level might be one instrument to increase the financial autonomy and room to maneuver and flexibility of universities across Europe. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking maybe to point out the importance of the academic discussion going on and heating it up. Even the I don't know if it's for the bigger countries the issue, but I mentioned this external evaluation passion Estonia has had, and very recent one actually suggested several things which I can see. I want to agree. For example, one of these being that Estonia should consider building up one national university and just one university for a state. But can you imagine what it means in social sciences, in humanities, if we have one university with a monopoly? We all know that if you reach this for a country, you can play this game that you have peers abroad, but it's national kind of subjects you can't, and then also the others. So that yes, the bureaucracy is coming from the windows and the doors, but we want to and we need to ensure the university leaders that it's not us who actually created, so that, or we want to make sure that we are not helping to increase the bureaucracy, the opposite, but then to understand that there are some things, administrative things to be done.
I have two thoughts. The first one is I think I created a very bad reputation for chancellor system. I think there are good examples how they can work, and we have some institution where it works wonderfully. I think there is a very high risk that it may fail. If the people leading the university are in tension with each other, then it may fail. So the selection of people who can work together is a very important part of a working chancellor system, and I think that is which require much more attention. But in many industries, it is a viable and possible legitimate way of operating business. So I don't think it is inherently flawed, this chancellor system. It is how the problem is how it is implemented in Hungary, and there are some problems with that. That could be changed if there is a wish for that, and that's a matter of question, of course. The second thought is about the constant problem or the constant tension between this collegiality and managerialism. And I like to think about managerialism as a car, where there is a kind of safety button in the car, and when you implement a kind of managerialist way of structure, it is something like when you just turn off that kind of safety button. It makes the car very fast and very high performative, but if it fails absolutely. And the question is whether we people here in the academia, in the university, do we have trust in the car, in the management, that they won't abuse that kind of situation if we just turn off that safety thing? Which means if we give the power and empower them to work as they see fit, whether will they misuse it somehow, or are there any other kind of safety mechanism, like the culture? We have the culture which prevents them to misuse it absolutely. If we have that kind of culture, then they won't do that. Then there is another safety button in the car, which is a hidden one, if I may say that. But without that, they may misuse it. And I think that is what lacks in Central and Eastern Europe. We don't have that kind of culture because people in that part of the world rarely have the existence. They are very dependent on a lot of things, and which makes them very difficult to resist if there is a huge pressure on them to resist for the management or to resist to the state. And that is the main problem. And that's why we really like to stick to Humboldtism, because the Humboldtism is the safety button, because that give us legal instruments or legal institutions to manage to preserve that thing.
Only two short considerations. First of all, maybe I am only one representative of the country which is out of European Union and out of the most possibilities which connected with the European Union, plus our situation with the war and other things. And second consideration is that last some years we have very rapid process of stratification of our university systems. We have one group which is more and more narrow of the best universities, and the another group, which is more and more wide, of the universities with a middle and sometimes not enough level of the quality assurance, of the quality of research and so on. And we must try the model how we can continue the living of the system with these very different groups. What we can do with the second group, how we can integrate maybe some of these participants of the second group in the different form of integration with some participants of the first group, or how we can lose some of the participants of this second group. This is maybe in the next some years the main goal and main problem of our national system.
Okay, and then to close, from my point of view, one of the things I believe at each nation or every country or every university, we need to look back at really which are the objectives of our university, okay? It's for the new generations. We need to teach to have the best professionals. We need to teach and research to have the best research and new advances to our country. And we do that, and I believe we are in Europe, so I want to put always this framework from Europe and the new initiatives and what that can represent for all of us, okay? And that needs to be the ultimate goal, okay? Not the kind of miseries that we have in each of the countries and each of the universities. But in the last few words, the one thing that sometimes is missing is the students, okay? So we have here many rectors, we have vice-rectors, chancellors, professors, but the university is about the students. So I want to give, and I believe it's a proposal for the LUMEN organization that maybe for next year, try to bring a panel with the students. What are the students thinking? How we need to change the university from the bottom up? And I believe that will be we will lower the average age of the conference and we'll give some fresh air as well to this conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. No final word from me. I would say let's thank our honorable panel members. Thank you so much, and the discussions can follow after we finished. Thank you so much.